The most important lie in the history of modern diplomacy died tonight, not slowly, not through negotiation, not through the careful unwinding of decades of careful pretense. It died because Iran put 400 ballistic missiles into the one facility whose targeting made lying impossible. And if you think this is just a story about Israel and Iran, you haven't been paying attention, because what ended tonight was not just a regional policy. What ended tonight was the foundational fiction that has kept the entire global nuclear order from unraveling for 60 years. The end of Israeli nuclear ambiguity is not a diplomatic footnote. It is a strategic earthquake, and the aftershocks are going to reach every capital on earth, including Washington, and they are going to reach into the lives of ordinary Americans in ways that the mainstream press is completely failing to explain. If this kind of analysis, the kind that doesn't sanitize, doesn't soften, and doesn't protect the comfortable lies that powerful institutions depend on, matters to you, then subscribe right now. Hit the bell, because what I'm about to walk you through tonight is going to reshape how you understand everything that follows in the months and years ahead. Let me start with what Israeli nuclear ambiguity actually was, because you cannot understand why its death matters until you understand what it was doing while it was alive. The official Hebrew term is amimut. It translates roughly to opacity, and for 60 years it was the most sophisticated piece of diplomatic architecture in the history of international relations. It was not simply Israel declining to confirm what its enemies already knew. It was a meticulously maintained, institutionally enforced, globally participated in fiction. A fiction so carefully constructed and so universally respected that not one Israeli prime minister, not one defense minister, not one military spokesperson across 8 separate decades of governments, of wars, of crises, of assassination attempts, of negotiations ever once made a public statement that formally acknowledged what every intelligence agency on the planet had known since the 1960s. Israel had nuclear weapons, somewhere between 80 and 400 warheads, depending on whose estimate you trust. Delivery systems capable of reaching every capital in the Middle East and beyond. A full strategic deterrent, quietly assembled, quietly maintained, and quietly never discussed. Why did the fiction survive for 60 years? Because it served everyone who participated in it. Think about that for a moment, because it is the most revealing fact about how international power actually works. The fiction served Israel because a state that has not officially acknowledged nuclear possession cannot be formally required to submit to the non-proliferation treaties. Inspection and verification regime. Israel never signed the NPT. By maintaining ambiguity, Israel possessed the deterrent benefit of nuclear weapons. No regional adversary willing to push far enough to find the actual red line without bearing the diplomatic and legal costs that acknowledged possession would create. The fiction served Arab governments because they could maintain their own NPT commitments without being formally required to respond to an acknowledged nuclear-armed neighbor. The moment Israel's capability is formally on the table, every Arab government faces a legal and political obligation to address it. As long as everyone pretended not to know, nobody had to act, and the fiction served the United States perhaps most of all because American law, specifically the Symington and Glenn Amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act, explicitly prohibits military and economic assistance to non-NPT states that pursue nuclear weapons capability for 60 years. American administrations of both parties, Democratic and Republican, liberal and conservative, maintained the ambiguity fiction specifically to avoid the legal catastrophe that acknowledged Israeli nuclear capability would create billions of dollars in annual military assistance. The entire architecture of the American-Israeli alliance, all of it technically illegal the moment the fiction collapses. Every government with a serious intelligence service played along, not because they were deceived, because they were complicit, and their complicity served their interests. That is the honest truth about how the international order actually functions, and it is the truth that tonight's events have ripped into the open. Now let's talk about what Iran actually did tonight, because the coverage you're getting from mainstream outlets is missing the most important dimension of this story entirely. The missile strike on the Negev facility is being reported as a military escalation, an attack, an act of aggression in an ongoing conflict. All of that is technically accurate and completely insufficient. What Iran executed tonight was not primarily a military operation. It was a diplomatic operation executed with military instruments, and the distinction matters enormously. Here is what you need to understand about the Negev facility. It is not a soft target, the hardened underground infrastructure of a complex that has been continuously upgraded for 60 years, specifically designed to survive exactly the category of conventional strike that 400 ballistic missiles represent, was not going to be meaningfully degraded by tonight's attack. Iran's strategic planners knew this. Every serious analyst in Tehran understood that 400 Zulfagar missiles, however accurate, however numerous, were not going to eliminate Israeli nuclear capability. The weapons storage facilities, the assembly infrastructure, the delivery system components, they are protected by engineering specifically designed to survive this. So why strike at all? Because Iran was not trying to destroy Israeli nuclear capability. Iran was trying to destroy the diplomatic architecture that concealed it, and in that objective, with a single strike package, Iran succeeded completely. Think about the trap that was constructed here, because it is genuinely elegant in its strategic logic, and it tells you something important about the quality of Iranian strategic planning that the American foreign policy establishment has consistently underestimated. If Israel responds to a strike on its most sensitive national security facility with language calibrated to maintain ambiguity, with the careful non-acknowledgement that 60 years of Amamut required its signals to its own population, to its regional adversaries, and to its American patron that it will not defend its nuclear infrastructure with the full weight of its deterrent posture, that signal is strategically catastrophic. It tells every adversary exactly where the line is and that the line can be pushed. But if Israel responds with language that acknowledges, even obliquely, even with careful diplomatic phrasing, what was struck and what was defended, it ends the ambiguity. It destroys the diplomatic shield that 60 years of extraordinary institutional discipline constructed. Iran forced Israel to choose between two forms of strategic damage with a single operational decision, and the satellite imagery that every intelligence service on Earth began distributing within hours of the first wave of strikes made the choice unavoidable. The images from the Negev show a facility of a very specific character, not a research reactor, not a conventional military installation, the physical infrastructure of a nuclear weapons complex, specific buildings damaged, specific underground access points struck, specific security perimeter configurations visible to anyone with eyes and a satellite subscription. An Israeli official standing before cameras and maintaining the fiction in front of that imagery would have been making a statement that the physical evidence contradicted in real time on every screen on Earth. The spokesperson who appeared before cameras tonight made a different choice. They used the language of a nuclear-armed state defending its strategic deterrent, not with a formal declaration, not with a press release announcing, yes, we have nukes, but with language precise enough that no informed observer could mistake its meaning. The ambiguity ended not with a declaration, but with the impossibility of maintaining it. That is Iran's victory tonight, not military, diplomatic, and it is a victory whose consequences will outlast every missile and every building destroyed. Here is where I need you to stop and really sit with the implications of what I just described, because this is the part of tonight's story that the mainstream coverage is going to bury under diplomatic process and unstatements and official responses. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1968 agreement that has organized global nuclear politics for nearly 60 years, that has been the foundation of every American argument for why nations should not pursue nuclear weapons, that has been the framework through which the United States has exercised extraordinary diplomatic pressure on countries from Iraq to North Korea to Iran. That treaty is now on life support. And the reasons why are not complicated. They are just uncomfortable. The NPT's authority rests on two foundational claims. First, that its verification regime can identify nuclear weapons development before it reaches operational capability. Second, that the norm it creates against nuclear weapons development is strong enough to constrain the calculations of states that might otherwise pursue that capability. Tonight's events have publicly and comprehensively refuted both claims. Israel's nuclear arsenal, now formally acknowledged in the most unavoidable way possible, developed entirely outside the NPT framework. It was not detected before it reached operational capability. It was not constrained by the norm the treaty was supposed to create. It was developed, maintained, and expanded over 60 years with the active complicity of the treaty's most powerful enforcer, the United States of America, in direct violation of American law. Every government that has accepted NPT membership as the foundation of its nuclear security calculation must now ask a question it has successfully avoided asking for decades: if the United States will spend 60 years maintaining a diplomatic fiction to protect an Alizon-declared nuclear arsenal, and if the international verification regime can miss an entire strategic nuclear program for 6 decades, then what exactly is the NPT protecting? and who exactly is it protecting against? The answer that tonight's events make unavoidable is deeply uncomfortable for every American official who has ever stood at a podium and lectured other nations about nuclear non-proliferation. The treaty protects against proliferation by states that lack sufficient determination and sufficient external support for states with those qualities. The treaty's deterrent effect has always been conditional. Israel proved it, North Korea proved it, and tonight, before the cameras of the entire world, the proof became impossible to deny. Now let's walk through what comes next regionally, because this is the part of tonight's story that should terrify every American who understands what nuclear proliferation actually means for the world their children are going to inherit. The regional proliferation cascade that acknowledged Israeli nuclear capability activates is not theoretical. It is not distant. It is not a worst-case scenario that responsible diplomacy might prevent. It has already begun in the political calculations being made right now in Riyadh, in Cairo, in Ankara. Let's start with Saudi Arabia, because the Saudi nuclear calculation is the most immediately consequential and the most advanced. Saudi Arabia has the financial resources that no other regional actor can match. It has an existing civilian nuclear infrastructure. The reactor cooperation agreement signed with South Korea in 2023 provides the technological foundation, and it has the political authorization from the top. In 2018, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stated publicly, on camera, with full clarity, "If Iran develops a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible." Tonight, Israel's acknowledged nuclear capability provides the second half of the trigger that statement identified. Iran's program was the first half. The Saudi program will not announce itself. It will proceed through the civilian infrastructure pathway that every proliferating state has used. Enrichment capability justified as fuel production, reprocessing research justified as waste management, weapons design work conducted within the deliberate ambiguity of dual-use research, the same pathway Israel used. The same pathway the ambiguity fiction concealed for 60 years. Saudi ambiguity will be the next chapter of the story that Israeli ambiguity just closed. Then there is Egypt. Egypt's nuclear calculation is more constrained by financial and technical limitations, but the political motivation that acknowledged Israeli nuclear capability creates in Cairo should not be underestimated by anyone who understands Egyptian strategic culture. An Egypt that formally accepts a regional environment in which both Israel and Iran possess nuclear weapons while Egypt does not is an Egypt that has accepted a subordinate strategic position in its own neighborhood. Egyptian strategic culture, the culture that produced Nasser's pan-Arab ambitions, that fought for wars against Israel, that has always defined itself as the dominant power of the Arab world, cannot accept that position without a domestic political cost that no Egyptian government can sustain. And Turkey is the most complex case in the cascade because it is a NATO member with American nuclear weapons on its territory, the B-61 gravity bombs at Incirlik Air Base that constitute a leg of American extended nuclear deterrence, but a Turkey that watches Saudi Arabia and Egypt move toward nuclear capability while remaining dependent on American extended deterrence, whose reliability the current crisis has demonstrated to be conditional, is a Turkey whose own strategic calculation is being fundamentally revised in real time. Erdogan has stated publicly that he considers it unacceptable for some regional states to have nuclear weapons while Turkey is treaty-bound to have none. Tonight's events have given that statement an operational urgency it previously lacked. The cascade timeline is measured in years, not decades, not overnight but already in motion, and by the time it is visible in headlines, the window for diplomatic intervention will have long since closed. Right now, in Washington, there is a legal and diplomatic emergency unfolding that the American foreign policy establishment has spent 60 years specifically working to prevent, and it is an emergency that directly implicates the money American taxpayers send to Israel every single year. The Symington and Glenn amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act are not ambiguous. They prohibit American military and economic assistance to non-NPT states that pursue nuclear weapons capability. They were written specifically to prevent exactly the situation that now exists. For 60 years, every American administration has maintained the ambiguity fiction specifically to avoid the legal confrontation those amendments would require. That confrontation has now arrived, and here is what will happen, because this is how American institutional power actually works, and it is important that you understand it without illusions. The American response will not be legal compliance. No administration operating in the current security environment is going to cut military assistance to Israel. What will happen is legislative emergency waivers, classified findings, the full toolkit of American institutional creativity applied to the problem. of maintaining an alliance relationship that the law nominally prohibits. American lawyers are drafting those documents tonight, and the creative legal architecture they construct will be visible to every NPT member government that has ever accepted American assurances about the treaty's universal application. It will be visible to every nation that has ever been pressured by American diplomats to maintain its NPT commitments, and its visibility will compound the treaty damage that Israeli acknowledgement has already created. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the strategic assessment of tonight's events is straightforward and uniformly positive from the Russian perspective. Every development that complicates American alliance management strains American diplomatic bandwidth and undermines American credibility as the guarantor of the rules-based international order serves Russian strategic interests. The NPT earthquake that acknowledged Israeli nuclear capability creates will consume American diplomatic attention and institutional credibility for years. That consumption leaves less available for European security, for Ukraine, for the China competition, every dimension of Russian strategic concern. Russia did not need to fire a single shot tonight to advance its strategic position. In Beijing, the calculus is more specific and more forward-looking. A Middle East with multiple acknowledged nuclear states, Israel, Iran. Eventually, Saudi Arabia is a Middle East whose energy supply, whose shipping lanes, whose regional stability requires management by a power with relationships across the proliferated landscape. China has been systematically building exactly those relationships. Its partnership with Iran, its economic relationships with Saudi Arabia, its diplomatic channels with Israel. Despite the current conflict, all of it positions China as the one major power with sufficient regional access to play a constructive role in managing a proliferated Middle East. The management role that American credibility damage has left vacant is the strategic prize that Beijing is now positioning to claim.